The RoboCop remake from 2014 is, in my opinion, one of the most unfairly maligned films of the past 20 years. It's a film that was basically dead on arrival the moment it was announced, because, if we're being honest, who exactly was asking for a RoboCop remake? Nobody, really. Because remaking a film as iconic and impactful as RoboCop was akin to remaking a classic film like Jaws, or Jurassic Park, or The Terminator. If a remake of any of these films were to be announced tomorrow, you could be sure that an enormous backlash would soon follow. With some films, there just seems to be this unspoken rule that they are not to be remade. Sequels are one thing, and each of these films mentioned has a bunch of sequels, running the gamut from middling to downright awful, but a full remake or hard reboot of any of these movies, even in current day Hollywood, seems to be completely out of the question. And yet, this unspoken rule was broken back in 2014 with the release of RoboCop. It received mixed reviews upon its release, and many consider it vastly inferior to the 1987 original, and when compared directly to the 80s original classic, it is. But is it really fair to compare the 2014 remake to the original? The obvious answer is yes, of course it's fair. It's directly inspired by it, takes many of its cues from it, and obviously wouldn't exist in the first place without it. In my view though, comparing RoboCop 2014 to RoboCop 1987 isn't really a productive way to view or analyse the newer film. It's true that the 2014 version had some pretty big shoes to fill, and let's face it, it was never going to be able to truly do this. It could have been written by the writers of the original and directed by Paul Verhoeven himself, and it would still have been considered a pale imitation of what came before. Creating an updated version of a character as iconic as Alex Murphy/RoboCop was always going to be a thankless task. With all this in mind, I think we have a good jumping off point for looking at the 2014 version in not necessarily a more forgiving light, but perhaps in a more neutral one. In my opinion, RoboCop 2014 has a lot going for it. It first of all fulfills all of its basic obligations. It's well structured, well made and nicely paced. It's well acted and boasts a range of known and respected talent with veteran actors such as Gary Oldman, Michael Keaton, Samuel L. Jackson and Jackie Earle Haley, considering the film a worthwhile project to take on. Joel Kinnaman was a good pick for the title role too, in my opinion. He's a good actor, but not so well known as to be distracting in the role. Now, the inherent problem with remakes and reboots, particularly those of films which were very popular in the not too distant past, is that they're asking quite a lot of the viewers. They're asking that you try to forget about the original version, which may be very near and dear to your heart, possibly even one of your all-time favourite films. This is not an easy thing to do. Oftentimes, this proves to be simply too much to ask of an audience, and direct comparisons between old and new will inevitably be made. Nevertheless, it is important to at least try to do this when watching the RoboCop remake. I managed to put the original film to the back of my mind for the most part while watching it, even with the clumsy callbacks to the original film which temporarily forced it back to the fore again. One example of this is where the character Maddox, played by Jackie Earle Haley, when criticising RoboCop's apparent inefficiency in a combat simulation, tells Dr. Norton, the mind behind RoboCop's creation, that he, quote, wouldn't buy that for $1. Anyone who has seen the original will be well aware of this much memed quote, and in the heightened, almost cartoonishly satirical world that the original film takes place in, it acts as a nice bit of world building, comic relief, and as a way to keep you on your toes as an audience member. It's weird and eccentric, like the universe of the film. However, in the remake, this is simply used as a way to denigrate the main character, and is used rather casually, almost as if the makers of the film felt obliged to include it, despite not really wanting to. It's only used once, but in my opinion, it shouldn't have been used at all. Perhaps a poster in an alleyway in the background including similar phrasing could have been used instead as an Easter egg, rather than including it as a distracting piece of dialogue. Another is near the end, where Alex Murphy, having cornered the CEO of OmniCorp, Raymond Sellers, played by Michael Keaton, tells him, "Dead or alive, you're coming with me." Again, it feels forced. I think the writers should have omitted all of these callbacks and tried, instead, to come up with their own original snappy one-liners. But despite these problems, if you are able to just take the film as it is, as its own thing, it is quite an enjoyable watch. All the basics are there. Alex Murphy and his struggle to maintain the connection he once had with his wife and son. Omni consumer products, called OmniCorp in this film, as a looming presence. And the themes of corporate greed and political satire are all present. The original film was incredibly satirical. It's primarily seen as a commentary on the privatisation of public services, with a corporation taking on law enforcement responsibilities, a common theme and recurring nightmare of many a writer who chooses to pen dystopian or cyberpunk fiction. It also used the status quo of the era it was made in, underpinned by the so-called Reaganomics of the time, to paint a picture of a world where these policies had been followed, not quite to their logical endpoint, but are well on their way towards it. The remake is also satirical, but it takes a different approach. It's more flashy, more obvious, more modern. But that makes sense. The world of 2014 was very different to the world of 1987. Podcasts, independent news networks, and YouTube news channels were now a thing. This is reflected in the aesthetic of the show being hosted by Samuel L. Jackson's character Pat Novak, called The Novak Element. It's a futuristic version of these kinds of new media, the film being set in 2028, but you can absolutely see the influence. I thought this was a fun way to show the audience what the political climate in the world of this film was like, and how the views of the people changed as the film progressed. We got to observe how the polling shown on the Novak element, if indeed accurate, showed what people's views on robots being given the power to enforce the law actually were. The 2014 reboot is 11 years old now, but it doesn't feel dated. It still feels current, and if we're being honest, it's the only kind of RoboCop film that could be made in the modern era. As much as people like to hold it and the original film side by side and directly compare the two, pointing at how the newer film misses the mark in terms of its meaning and satire, it needs to be said that if the 1987 RoboCop was made in the age of the internet and social media, it would fall utterly flat. That film could only be made in the late 1980s, in the wake of the Reagan administration. That's the only time where it would make sense. It's still a timeless classic, of course, and still relevant in its own way, but to repeat it beat for beat in 2014 wouldn't have worked at all. As such, it's unfair to expect the remake to reach those same heights in the exact same way as the original. In terms of villains, the focus has shifted quite drastically in the 2014 version. There is no Clarence Boddicker in this film, though there is a, frankly, weak and bland stand-in for him named Antoine Vallon, though he only lightly factors into the story. He's behind the plot to take out Alex Murphy, which in this film takes the form of a car rigged to explode, rather than the comically gruesome event that almost kills him in the first film. 2014 was right in the middle of the gritty, realistic remake era though, so Murphy being on the business end of 1,000 bullets and still somehow surviving was never going to be the direction that this newer film took. There is also no Bob Morton or Nancy Allen, though in the case of the latter, Jack Lewis, played by Michael K. Williams, serves as a stand-in of sorts, being Murphy's partner. Another departure from the source material comes with Alex Murphy being a police detective who does undercover work rather than a young cop like in the original. This is a change that I personally didn't really enjoy, as the idea of Officer Murphy going from being a regular beat cop to the ultimate badass RoboCop was, to me, much more compelling than Alex Murphy going from hardened detective to slightly more hardened RoboCop. I will say that for me though, the standout sequence has to be where Dr. Norton reveals the extent of the damage done to Alex Murphy by the car explosion. All that's left of him is his head, his lungs, and one of his hands. He's being kept alive artificially by the machinery that now makes up the majority of his being, and this was a rather disturbing visual. I watched the film with my fiancée, and she and I both were quite shocked by this. It even came up in conversation between us a couple of days later. It stuck with us. And also my brother, who watched the film several years ago and found it extremely boring, did say that the only part of the film he thought was at all interesting was this same sequence. If this version of RoboCop had a few more unique elements like this peppered throughout, and resisted the urge to include clunky callbacks to the original, it could have really distinguished itself as its own thing, and avoided some of the more uncharitable comparisons. Now, something that feels a bit lacking in the remake is the treatment of the Ed 209s, which in this film seem to be just a way to furnish the background, rather than being a genuinely threatening, though comical, presence like they were in the original film. They've been stripped of their personality, if you know what I mean. They're obviously completely CGI in this film, as stop motion had long since fallen out of style in mainstream Hollywood, and this does cause them to be far less striking than they were the first time they were seen. They just seem to blend in with everything else that's going on. I am slightly biased here though, as I personally really love stop motion animation. They also don't really factor into the story all that much, and are only really included to show that Omnicorp has an overwhelming international presence as a provider of law enforcement products and services, with the US being the only holdout. In short, I think the Ed 209s were sadly underutilised this time around. I think the designs of RoboCop's two outer casings that he has are nicely done, and serve as excellent updates to the classic look. I find it quite funny how he starts off silver, looking quite similar to how he appeared in the original film. But partway through the film, Omnicorp CEO Raymond Sellers decides that a redesign is needed to make RoboCop more appealing to consumers. He wants the casing to be black instead, hammering home the point that RoboCop is a product owned by Omnicorp, and whatever they want to do, whatever changes they want to make to their property, they have the right to do so. But near the end, after the black shell is badly damaged following the final fight, he goes back to the old silver one once again. It's almost as if the film itself is saying, yeah, the original was better. Anyway, that's my retrospective on the RoboCop remake from 2014. I've talked about the things I liked about it, and also where I thought it was lacking. I'd like to think I gave it a fair shake and an honest appraisal. In short, I think it is an enjoyable, entertaining and well-made film, but I can see why it would have disappointed a lot of people upon its release. But much of what it set out to do, I think it did quite well. Not perfectly, but well enough to warrant spending a couple of hours watching it. There are indeed far worse films out there that you could spend your time on. But what did you think of RoboCop 2014? Do you agree with my analysis, or do you have a differing view? Let me know in the comments below. This has been the Bewarecast, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.